eastwards, so rain arriving into the Midlands by the end of the day and then into the early hours across southeast England. Clearer skies following as we head towards Monday morning. Some showers possible. Temperatures holding up around the mid to high single figures, under the cloud across the southeast, 11 or 12 degrees. But it is a cloudy start here Monday morning. Some outbreaks of rain first thing. This pushes away, and then generally a brighter day for many. A mixture of bright or sunny spells, some scattered showers. Showers most frequent across the north and the east of the UK. Some of these could be heavy at times. Best of the sunshine towards the south and the west, but a northerly breeze, so it will feel quite chilly for the time of year. Temperatures reaching the mid to high teens at best. Over the next few days, we expect further showers on Tuesday, but turning drier for Wednesday and Thursday. Temperatures around average, but it just starts to feel a little warmer towards the end of the week. See you again soon.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage. Here on GB News, we will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, "Oh my God, what's she doing now?"
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now, eagle-eyed observers will see that I'm not in my normal studio. It's quite exciting, actually. GB News has got new studios coming in Westminster in the near future. And in the meantime, I'm going to be here. So Buckingham Palace last week, this week here. We'll move anywhere, frankly, and bring the news to you. And we've got a really fun-packed show, as is ever the case. Grant Shapps, the Energy Secretary, is going to be on. I'm going to be asking him, naturally, about the net zero plans that the Tories keep on pursuing, even though their voters don't necessarily like them because they cost them more money. I'm also going to be speaking to Jonathan Reynolds, the Shadow Business Secretary. That's an interesting one because Labour's manifesto appears to have been leaked and it's got some quite interesting ideas in it that I'll be quizzing him on. And we've got a lesser-spotted Liberal Democrat on. Christine Jardine is going to join me. I want to find out whether they will go into coalition with Labour. Could it be another coalition of chaos? I'll ask her. And I'm also going to be joined by George Brandis, who's the former Australian High Commissioner to UK. I'm just intrigued by this whole talk about Australia maybe going republic because it's now a left-wing government in power, and I'm wondering whether Albanese is going to move with that now that the King is on the throne, although he fawned all over him at Buckingham Palace last weekend, so who knows? And this is a really interesting one. Sir Charles Walker is going to be telling me about what it's like being in politics and living with OCD, and that's to mark Mental Health Awareness Week. Now, let's first take you through the news headlines and indeed the headlines of the Sunday papers this morning, as we always do. Let's start with the Sunday Telegraph. And that splashes with Labour to give EU citizens the vote. That's something we're going to be exploring a little later in the show. That's one of Keir Starmer's ideas. The Sunday Times goes with Nursing Union Chief in U-turn over pay deal. That's about Pat Cullen, the head of the RCN, apparently wanting a double-digit wage increase. The Mail on Sunday splashes Kate's Eurovision tribute to Ukraine. That's the Princess of Wales being in that beautiful blue dress and playing the piano. The Sunday Express, Rishi's vow, I won't budge, he says. That's about him with regard to facing pressure from some of the right-wingers in his party. The Sun on Sunday goes with Rio nabs intruder in home raid terror. That's about the former footballer Rio Ferdinand. The Sunday Mirror, I'm a celeb saved me from cancer, and that's about an EastEnders star being spotted with cancer after he appeared on the reality TV show. Now, let me bring in my paper reviewer extraordinaire, Michael Portillo, former Defence Secretary and GB News presenter from 11. Michael, I love this double shifting you're doing. Honestly, this is hard work incarnate.
We're going to come to Labour's attitude to hard work in a moment.
We will come to that. Yes. Great stuff. Now, first of all, let's talk about interview of the day. It's in the Mail on Sunday. Rishi Sunak spoken to the political editor, Glenn Owen. I say interview of the day. They didn't splash it. It's great to get it. And it's a nice sit down, and Rishi's all very much, you know, I'm steadying the ship. But it didn't elicit many news lines. Is this just because, actually, the Prime Minister is a bit too safety first in his approach?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's a bit of a nightmare that an interview with the Prime Minister is buried in the middle of the newspaper. And some of what I read I found rather painful. There's all this stuff about how at the coronation concert his wife encouraged Rishi to dance and they got dancing. And I mean, this is Theresa May territory, isn't it? This is a man who's been told by his advisers that he's perceived as not having an outgoing personality, and what can you do to fill in the gaps? So I found it rather a painful interview, but as far as the politics is concerned, all he really has to say is that it's steady as we go, settling the ship and so on. But that is not what a lot of people in his party want.
Yeah.
Priti Patel and others are talking a very different sort of language. And Priti Patel and others are saying it's not just we who think we're on the wrong lines, it looks like the voters think that as well, because the results in the local elections were even worse than the worst predictions that have been made by the party.
They're managing of expectations, superseded even their own expectations.
I mean, speaking as a Tory voter, which obviously I am, what is my reason for voting Tory next time? What is it the Tories are offering me? They're offering me high public spending and high taxation. They have, no differentiation on these matters with Labour. And, how do you win elections unless you differentiate your party? And particularly unless you differentiate your party along lines that people expect.
Yes.
At the moment, the Conservative Party is not following the Conservative Party brand. And that seems to me quite a difficult electoral strategy.
Let's just try and defend Rishi Sunak here, because lots of people tell me how they love him because he's extremely hard-working. He's across his brief. He did have a burgeoning in-tray because perhaps his predecessors weren't across their brief. So he's got a very tough job, hasn't he? And he could be saying, look, we've had enough of personality politics. We've had enough of chaos and confusion. I am steadying the ship. I'm a very safe pair of hands. And actually, that's not just what the party needs, but the country needs needs right now. There is an argument for that, Portillo. I mean, in the sense that he's kind of managed to close that gap, which was gaping under Liz Truss and following the breakdown of the economic policy.
I grant you all of that. But those are not things that, in the end, will win the election. They may stop a complete rout. They may stop the Conservatives being wiped out. I agree that, had Liz Truss remained in place, that might have been what happened. But I think those in the Conservative Party who are saying, OK, you've steadied the ship, you have all these credentials, you are a trustworthy person, you're also a very likeable person, you have marvellous personal qualities, but you've also got to give people reasons for voting Conservative.
Yes.
I think there's quite a lot in that as well.
One of the reasons why people are saying that they might vote Conservative is because they think Labour will be even worse.
Yes.
And what I think is also interesting when it comes to this manifesto is whether it does mar with what people are saying in general about Keir Starmer, a lack of policy platform and all the rest of it. Now, there's an interesting piece, because everyone's having their say on this, of course. Everyone's having their say on what both the government and the shadow policies should be. I'm interested in Tim Shipman's piece, which we called the think piece of the day, because he's talking about backseat drivers. So on one hand, you've got Rishi Sunak, plagued by the likes of Liz Truss, off to Taiwan, Boris Johnson making his interventions on Brexit, Theresa May apparently sitting in the Commons complaining about the immigration stuff. You've then got on the left, Tony Blair. The Tony Blair Institute seems to be firing things into my inbox every 5 minutes. We've also go even further back and look at Gordon Brown making interventions. John Major doesn't seem to be able to zip it. So have we got too much backseat driving in politics, Michael?
Well, the number of ex-prime ministers is in excess of anything that you and I have experienced before. However, the phenomenon is not in any way new. Ted Heath criticised Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher criticised John Major. John Major took Boris Johnson to the Supreme Court. Can you imagine a former Conservative Prime Minister taking a present Conservative Prime Minister to the Supreme Court? So there's nothing particularly new. And, I mean, it has made me chuckle because I saw John Major up close in those days and I know how wounded and hurt he was every time that Margaret Thatcher made a comment. And the way he attacked Boris, John Major, was extraordinary. I also think there's an even broader phenomenon here, which is we are a country now that has no agreement about our destiny whatsoever.
Yes.
Obviously we're divided on whether to be in Europe or not in Europe. We're divided about our global role. We're not even, 100% sure about NATO and the United States and so on. But even on sort of things that are purely domestic, do we want to build a new railway? Do we want a third runway at Heathrow? We have no consensus. We have no agreement.
But has there ever been consensus? I mean, haven't these arguments between left and right always existed? I appreciate that Brexit's probably driven a further wedge. But it's like how, from my opinion, lots of people were looking at Major and saying, well, why are you in a position to comment on anything? I mean, his premiership ended in disaster.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
Yes, exactly,
I lost my seat. Yes, I remember all that. Actually, I don't entirely agree with you that it's always been like that in the sense that I'm going back a long way now, but I think in the kind of 60s, everyone was agreed about modernisation. Everyone was agreed that the economy had to move forward. So infrastructure, for example, was not a controversial policy. But now anything is a controversial policy. Do we want to be more modern or not? No, we don't. Saving the environment is the most important thing. Net zero is the most important thing. So we're not even agreed on economic growth anymore. Yes. And by the way, in my programme, I'm going to be talking about a new book, which also suggests that a lot of foreign actors may be involved in all of this, through trolling, through disinformation and so on.
That's interesting.
Helping to break down any kind of national consensus on anything, helping to remove the glue that holds our society together.
Although the Tory party don't help themselves. I mean, if you look at the front of The Observer, it's talking about Tory anarchy again. I mean, is it helpful, just on that subject, before we move on to Labour briefly, for Priti Patel to be absolutely laying into Rishi Sunak at a time like this, when they're at least 20 points behind still?
Well, I suppose my answer to that is, you see, I have some sympathy with what she's saying. One's view of this is always conditioned by whether you agree with the person or not.
But she's saying he's managing decline, and that's not really a ringing endorsement from somebody who was Home Secretary.
No, indeed. But of course, what she believes, and what many in the Tory party believe, is that you have to offer some prospect of growth. I mean, the idea of growth, the idea of private enterprise, of business as sort of gone out of the Conservative lexicon.
Yes.
I mean, the only reason we see business and the Conservative Party linked in newspaper stories at the moment is because so much of business is attacking the Conservative government for being anti-business. I mean, what an extraordinary situation.
But is that a hangover from Boris Johnson famously saying F business?
No, it's no. Again, it's more than that. It's that you know, Rishi and Jeremy Hunt have this fixation that, you know, dealing with the deficit is kind of the only thing. And if that means getting rid of the, you know, the duty-free concession that was so helpful to much of business, if that means putting up corporation tax to an absurd level, they're going to do it. And naturally, business is not on their side.
Let's move on to leak of the day. There's been more information forthcoming about Labour's potential manifesto. We already heard that they want to advocate working from home. They want to scrap the Trade Unions Act, which will mean that there may be more strikes. They're talking about giving workers more powers, including the fact that they can turn around to their bosses and say, please don't email or call me after 5:30. And then we also hear from the Telegraph that there's this suggestion that they might want to give EU citizens the vote, along with 16 and 17-year-olds. Your response, Michael?
Well, I can see that they think that it would be electorally advantageous to give the vote to people who have settled status in the United Kingdom and who are paying tax, by the way. That's one of their preconditions. And, of course, to people between the age of 16 and 18, because these people are more likely to vote Labour. Actually, I'm quite sympathetic on the EU point. I think people have settled status here. There's quite a good argument that they should vote. I'm much less convinced that people between 16 and 18 should have the vote. But obviously, Labour thinks it is of advantage. I wonder, by the way, whether they've done their analysis. Lots of East Europeans are highly conservative because they've seen socialism close up in their own countries. These ideas, I think it's quite difficult to know how they'll play out. I think some of them are giving a bit of ammunition to the Conservatives. You know, when you just hear this policy, what EU citizens getting the vote, it sounds as though this is unpicking Brexit. And I think, you know, a lot of voters will be suspicious about that. And some voters will think that the idea that your boss should not be able to send you an email out of hours is extraordinary. I mean, a lot of people are quite unhappy by how disrupted work is already.
Yes. I mean, you do take work home with you because of the advent of the mobile phone. However, when we're talking about growing the economy, some of these policies seem a bit akin to sort of France. And look what's happened there.
Oh, totally akin to France. It is modelled on a French policy. And, you know, historically, certainly Conservatives, sometimes even Labour, have said, oh, the last thing we want to do is what France does, because France has had, you know, a very short working week and all sorts of restrictions on work, and we've alleged that this has been a very bad thing for the French. However, of course, British productivity is one of the lowest in the European Union, I think. Here are measures, I suspect, that will lower it still further.
Yes. Michael Portillo, thank you very much.
Camilla,
we'll see you again at 11. Thank you.
Yes.
Now, the People's Panel is in Hemel Hempstead, along with our very own Tom Harwood. Tom, I'd love to know, because I started out on the Hemel Hempstead Gazette, so it's a town very close to my heart, what the good people of Hemel make of the politics of the week and what questions they might have for our panellists today, considering we've also got Grant Shapps coming in just a moment. Tom.
Yes, no, really excited to hear what the people of Hemel Hempstead have to say. Of course, we're here in Marlowe's Cafe and Restaurant, a brilliant cafe in the heart of the town. And I'm delighted to be joined, first of all, by Isla, the manager here. And Isla, how's business going?
We love to welcome our fantastic customers here, but unfortunately, due to the cost of living crisis, we have noticed a drop-off in our customer basis.
Well, let's hope that things go from strength to strength and bounce back as hopefully inflation starts to fall. But thank you so much for your hospitality here and welcoming us into the cafe. Let's have a word now with our panel of brilliant contributors, GB News viewers, to get a sense of what the people of Hemel Hempstead have to say. John, first of all, thanks for being with us. What's a big issue that exercises you at the moment?
As a small business owner and IT consultant, I'm finding the current tax regime is very challenging. The big increase in corporation tax, which, although some people think it's only paid by Amazon and big companies, it's actually paid by small companies, one-man companies like mine, this cafe, the hairdresser down the street. And that, coupled with an increase in dividend taxation, which is how small business owners actually get paid, is really very challenging, and I'm sure it's going to cause significant inflation and problems for high street businesses, especially when rents and business rates are constantly going up as well.
Big concerns about the level of taxation. Now, Maud, what are the issues that really at the forefront of your mind?
At the moment, Tom, it's my 19-year-old. I have a 19-year-old daughter, which is an adult female without male genitalia. And this will be her first opportunity to vote in a general election to choose our next government. And my concerns are, where does she put her vote? It's precious. She studied A-level politics, so she has this vote. But on the one side, we have a gentleman who doesn't wear a seatbelt, who stabs people in the back, who uses up NHS appointments when he can afford private, and thinks that by giving his mother a couple of extra customers, that's going to solve the NHS problems, and it won't. On the other side, we have Labour, and I have one word, Tom: jalfrezi.
Well, on that note, let's move over to Richard. And Richard, what are your big concerns with regard to politics at the moment?
Well, we have a Conservative government not acting like a Conservative government. We have too much state control, and we also, as John said earlier on, taxation. VAT is too high, income tax is too high, inheritance tax is the most pointless and bureaucratic tax I think there can possibly be. So I'm looking for a Conservative government to be a Conservative government and be a low taxation, low state economy.
Yeah, it seems like they're not living up to those principles at the moment. We do have, however, today on the programme, the Energy Secretary and the Shadow Business Secretary. And John, I wonder if you had any questions specifically for the Energy Secretary, Grant Shapps?
Yeah, the whole system of trying to get to so-called net zero and removing hydrocarbon fuels from both domestic and transport usage is going to require a significant amount of increase in electricity generation. Now, I used to work in the electricity supply industry, so I have some inside knowledge, as it were. I would expect that we would need between 6 and 8 full-size nuclear power stations to generate the amount of power, the amount of energy that we are currently using from hydrocarbons. But if we have that, and that's 30, 40, 50 years build and all the NIMBY problems, how do we get the power to people's houses? Do we have the infrastructure? And the answer is no. The fuse on my incoming electricity supply is 60 amps. A full-size central heating boiler would be 100 amps, and so would a car charger. Infrastructure is...
It's about getting that infrastructure built. Now, just very quickly, because we are running a bit out of time, Maud, what would you like to say to the politicians?
I'd like to ask Grant Shapps who writes his Excel spreadsheets. Is it him or is it the elf on the shelf?
And Richard, a final word to you.
Yes, very quickly. I'm an electric car owner, and coming back to John's point, the infrastructure is very, very poor, so much so that I've cancelled all my subscriptions to the public charging points, and I only charge at home because the cost of it is just ridiculous. I do believe the future of renewable energy should be hydrogen cars. Electric cars are a stopgap, but I do enjoy driving it.
So some big questions there about infrastructure, but also a little question for Grant Shapps about the elf on the shelf. Back to you, Camilla.
Thank you very much for that, Tom. I don't know whether I'm going to be able to sandwich the elf on the shelf in. By the way, can I just say I've had many a lovely full English at the Marlowe's Cafe in Hemel Hempstead. I do recommend it. Now, Grant Shapps, Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, joins me now. He's also the Tory MP for Welwyn Hatfield. Mr Shapps, I hope you can hear me. Lots of questions there from my People's panel about electric cars and so on. But let's start with net zero and also heat pumps. Now, Minister, have you got a heat pump on your own home?
I'm having one fitted, actually, at the moment. And to the last point, or one of the points, one of the gentlemen was... it costs about the same as having a boiler put in after you get a grant. There's a boiler upgrade grant. So a bit like happened with cars, with EVs, when they first started coming around. And that gets it to around the same price. So I'm doing it to sort of learn about all the complications. And one of your guests was just saying you have to have infrastructure upgrades, including something that's just happened in my garage, which is upgrading the fuse panel. Actually, up to 80 amps was sufficient for both the heat pump and an electric car.
So what's the final bill then, Mr.
His question. I won't know that quite yet because they're still doing the survey work, but I expect it will be about £3,000. So Octopus say they can do 2,500 for a standard boiler in a house. British Gas say they can do about £3,000. It's very much similar to fitting a replacement boiler when you get to those levels. But there are a few complications, including making sure that your house is well enough insulated. So that's the process that I'm also having to go through the checks on.
Because Chris Skidmore did a report on this, and he estimated conservatively that it would cost up to £6,000 for people to upgrade their homes to the government's recommended eco standards. Obviously, you're a minister, you're well paid, so £3,000 is probably more affordable. If it's up to £6,000, how on earth do you expect people on minimum wage to come up with this money?
So I think we're conflating two different things, confusing two different things there. One is what Chris Skidmore was talking about was how we insulate homes in order to make them viable for them being able to fit things like heat pumps. The other thing is the cost of the heat pump. As I mentioned, the cost of the heat pump is now coming into line with the cost of replacing your boiler. So we're getting to very similar prices. On the insulation front, we've actually got huge amounts of help coming in, particularly for people on lower incomes. So something like £12 billion, over £12 billion announced and partly spent on making sure those homes are better insulated. Put that into numbers for you. When we came to power, only 14% of homes were sufficiently insulated. Now it's nearly 50% of homes. So that money's been spent and it's working.
But are you concerned by some concerns that have been raised in the week that heat pumps won't heat people's homes as effectively as gas boilers?
Well, I'm going to find out the answer to that. We do already know that heat pumps work at a lower temperature, but they stay on for longer. That's the way that they operate. It does mean that you do need to make sure that the home is reasonably well insulated, and that's why we're putting all this time and energy into insulating homes. And obviously, it's much better not to have to. It's much better not to have to produce more heat if you can just not let the heat escape, so it makes sense to do insulation. But it's not straightforward. I just want to be clear. It's not straightforward. That's why I'm going through the process myself, because I wanted to actually learn about it. We needed a new boiler. I wanted to learn about it and all the complications that do arise. But we do know that we can't rely on gas from, Putin and elsewhere. So we do need to move away, not just for net zero, but for also our own energy security as well.
Can we move on to the retained EU law bill? Because there are sources apparently quoting you on your behalf in the weekend's papers saying that you think it was wrong for Kemi Badenoch to have abandoned the scrapping of 4,000 EU laws. You apparently said that it was entirely achievable. So are you at odds now with your successor as business secretary?
No, I'm sure this has happened to you. When you open the newspaper and you see something, you're like, what the, when did I say that? In my sleep or something? I think it probably just refers back to comments that whilst I was business secretary, I was briefly in charge of the legislation. And at the time we had the legislation on track, what happened subsequently, of course, was more of the bits of EU law which were left over. They're sort of literally uncovered by I think the British Library, looking at laws, have found additional pieces of law. Actually, the current business secretary, is doing a terrific job already. I think this year we'll have over 2,000 of those laws scrapped. She's just announced 600 of those in a piece of what's called secondary legislation, which she's put down in the House of Lords. So we're well on the way to it, and I'm not really sure where these stories come from.
But it's a broken promise on Brexit, isn't it? I mean, there's a lot of dissent within the party. It's a broken promise on Brexit. You've also got Priti Patel talking about Rishi Sunak managing decline. Once again, the Tories are engulfed in psychodrama and infighting.
Look, first of all, we're the party that got Brexit done. If you care about that, then we're the people who sorted it out. These are the last few leftover bits of law that we're also scrapping. I read in the newspapers today, by the way, that Sir Keir Starmer wants to reopen the Brexit settlement, and he's talking about changing voting rights for some citizens and all this sort of thing, which is something which is actually agreed with the EU. So he wants to reopen Brexit. I wouldn't trust him on that. But back to Priti Patel's comments. Look, I think this, and she was referring to this set of elections. which were obviously very difficult for the Conservatives. There weren't a good set of elections for us. But this was the first opportunity people have had to comment on all the shenanigans of last summer and those many leadership changes that went on. I think people were venting their frustration. I actually think that Rishi Sunak, in his 5-point plan to halve inflation and grow the economy and reduce our debt and cut the NHS waiting list and stop the small boats, I think he's doing exactly the right things. And let's judge him against that. Let's judge this government against that when it comes to the next election, which is still.
You could say that you've been judged at the local elections and been found wanting, though, Mr. Shapps. On tax, you were a former business secretary. There's been a lot of complaints. The Daily Mail has run a campaign about the scrapping of this tax-free status for luxury goods. Is this actually an anti-government, anti-business government? And when it comes to the autumn statement, should taxes come down, in your view?
I'm a Conservative. I'd love to have lower taxes. I'm also a realist who understands that we've been through a once in a 100+ year pandemic, which cost the country a fortune, cost the world a fortune. And then that's been followed in quick succession by Putin's illegal, ghastly war in Ukraine, which again has cost households a fortune, not least in energy prices. And we've been generous as a government in trying to wrap our arms around people, furlough schemes, things like paying around half of the typical energy bill this winter, though it won't have felt like that because the price rises were still much higher. But if we hadn't done all of that, we'd be in trouble. All of that means we are a situation where our debt is about the same size as our annual sort of economy. So 100% of GDP, nearly 100%. And, you know, as a Conservative, I also don't believe on passing that debt on to future generations, right? So there's got to be a time for tax cuts. I believe in them passionately, but the Chancellor has to make sure that we've got the confidence of markets, that we've got a proper plan in place, long-term plan in place. And that's what he's doing. So you asked me about any specific tax, including that tax that you're referring to for tourists. Actually, the Chancellor's got to balance that out with making sure that our interest rates remain lower than they would be if we just spent the money.
Mr. Shapps, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Perhaps you'll let us know how your heat pump installation goes in future. Thank you. Now,
oh, yes, and by the way, the answer is the ELF on the spreadsheets.
Oh, the ELF is on the spreadsheets. Good to know. I'll let Maud know over in Hemel Hempstead. Thank you. Lots more to come on the show today. I'll be speaking to Labour's Jonathan Reynolds. I'll also be speaking to the Liberal Democrat MP Christine Jardine. And Australia's former High Commissioner to the UK will be telling me how his country managed to stop small boat crossings. Don't go anywhere.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now, in just a minute, I'm going to be speaking to Labour's Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds. But first, here's the news headlines with Rory Smith.
Thank you very much, Camilla. The latest from the GB newsroom. Nurses are calling for a double-digit pay offer to prevent further strike action. Head of the Royal College of Nursing, Pat Cullen, told the Sunday Times the government risks another 6 months of industrial action if negotiations aren't reopened. Members rejected a 5% offer, which was accepted by 14 other unions. A new ballot for strikes will be held later this month. Liverpool's been seen as the big winner after hosting the Eurovision Song Contest, with the Prime Minister saying the city has done the UK and Ukraine proud. Swedish pop star Loreen made history, becoming the first woman to win the event twice. The country now ties with Ireland for the most Song Contest victories, both claiming 7 titles. The UK's entry, Mae Muller, finished second last, behind Germany. She may have been disappointed, but her fans certainly weren't.
She did a brilliant job and she's represented the UK so well.
She was amazing. She did the UK proud, definitely.
Not number 1, but I think we did well. Amazing. Top 5 performance, easily. She's a winner!
Well, as the song contest was underway, Russian missiles hit the hometown of the Ukrainian entry. Ternopil was struck as pop group Tvorchi performed in Liverpool. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is in Germany meeting with President Frank-Walter Steinmeier. He's hoping to acquire more support from one of his key allies against Russia's invasion of his country. Labour says it has plans to create 80,000 new jobs in the car industry. The party says it will part-finance 8 factories to achieve their goal. It will also help power nearly 2 million electric vehicles. Well, under the proposed plan, the West Midlands will benefit from 28,000 jobs and the North West from 11,000. A truce between Israel and the militant Islamic Jihad group is in place. Fighting continued for a couple of hours after the agreement, with Israel's military saying it hit targets in response to rocket fire. It's hoped the truce will end the worst episode of the cross-border fire since a 10-day war in 2021. Turkey is bracing itself for possible protests or clashes as voting opens for the presidential election. People across the country, including President Erdogan, are heading to polling stations in the first round of the elections. The President faces the biggest political challenge of his career, hoping for re-election after 20 years in power. Opinion polls show it will be tight, though, with a clear indication of the result expected this evening. TV, online, DAB+ radio and on TuneIn. This is GB News. Now, though, back to Camilla.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Jonathan Reynolds, who's Shadow Business Secretary. Mr. Reynolds, I hope you can hear me. You've come out with an announcement today. You want to boost jobs in the automotive sector. You want nearly 2 million more electric vehicles. That's obviously great news, but at the same time, I'm confused. If there are more electric vehicles on the streets, it means that air quality will improve. So why is the Labour Mayor, Sadiq Khan, proceeding with this ULEZ that is so unpopular with the people of Greater London?
Good morning. Sorry, there's some noise here. I couldn't quite hear that, but I think you were asking about the popularity of electric vehicles. Yes, they're very popular. That most of the highest level, I think, of electric vehicle registrations were made in the sales last year. But this policy is about making sure we make them in the UK, and that is fundamentally important. Without a battery industry, we'll not continue with our existing automotive sector. And for us, this is a massive opportunity the government is missing, and that's why we want the kind of industrial strategy, industrial policies that we see in other countries, but we don't see here, to make sure we've got a future for this sector.
But Mr. Reynolds, I'm also asking about the unpopularity of ULEZ. That's a Labour mayoral policy in London. Why, if you're improving air quality with more electric cars, do you need the ULEZ, which only penalises people who are working shifts, who have to drive around white vans and are therefore probably in a lower socio-economic group?
Well, the ULEZ policy is a policy for the mayor. He's responsible for clean air. Local authorities and combined authorities can be sued if the air quality is insufficient, and part of having directly elected mayors is so they can stand and fall by the policies they're putting forward. But I think cleaner air is an essential health issue in the UK. We've seen the government mandate local areas to do it, and it's got to understand if it puts that mandate in place, local areas will respond to deliver that. And
but
there is a longer-term transition. Electric vehicles are cleaner, clearly.
But if air is cleaner, why do you need a ULEZ?
Well, because there are lots of issues relating to heavier vehicles and how they're used, where electric vehicles will not be the answer to that. There's a need to make that transition to hydrogen and fuel cells, and this is all part of the process. But you need incentives in place to do that, and I believe that is what the policy of the London Labour Party and the Mayor is in place for that. And I think that the health benefits from clean air are very well understood, and I understand why he wants to promote those in the area he's elected and responsible for.
The Conservatives have identified Labour having 90 billion in uncosted spending commitments. How are you going to pay for these policies?
Well, that's nonsense. The Conservative Party itself, its own record on the economy is so dire. We see these kind of allegations now and again, where we've put forward any revenue spending increases that we want to make. So with the health service, that is funded by scrapping the non-dom rule, the tax regime for the super rich. Our plan for breakfast clubs is funded by the change in taxation regime
doesn't
for
make 90
private
billion,
education
though, does it?
in the UK. No, but it doesn't add up to 90 billion because that's the Conservative Party and their researchers trying to make up some figures. Any spending pledges that we've made are funded specifically from the revenue we would raise. So when you've got that health policy, you've got the non-dom policy that would pay for that. Where you've got commitments to breakfast clubs, they're funded by the changes to the private school education. There will be increased investment spending under a Labour government. That is to leverage in the greater private investment that we need, because we cannot continue with an economy with the lowest business investment in the G7, where growth is lower than it should be, even by historical standards in the UK. And that is part of our policy, but I reject entirely the Conservative claim that we make unspending.
If it isn't 90 billion
commitments, that's just not the case.
OK, what's the figure then if it isn't 90 billion?
No, I don't recognise that figure at all.
What is the figure?
There are no uncosted spend.
But how much are you planning to spend?
In the Labour
how much public money are you planning to spend on some of these pledges? If it's not 90 billion and that figure's wrong, can you give me the headline figure, please?
OK, so the scrapping the non-dom tax regime raises 3.2
No, I'm
billion
talking about
pounds,
Labour's
and that is
spending
what we would
pledges.
use to expand the NHS workforce.
I'm talking about the cost of Labour spending pledges.
The aggregate spending pledges. I'm telling you where there are specific increases in public service revenue spending. We always say where that money would come from, and that is, I can give you specifics for each of those, and I reject entirely the Conservative lines they put out that there are any uncosted spending commitments.
I get it, you're rejecting 90 billion, but you must know the total cost of everything you've pledged to spend. What's that headline figure if it's not 90 billion?
I don't have the aggregate figure for all of our pledges. I can tell you where each spending commitment comes from when we make it. But I think what we see from the Conservative Party on this is, frankly, embarrassment at their record, embarrassment at the Liz Truss era, the Kwasi Kwarteng era that crashed the economy, and these sort of absurd claims they put forward without any basis for them. If they're making that claim, they should be able to put out where they've added that up to, and they can't do that because they know they're, frankly, covering for themselves and the awful record they've got.
You could argue, Mr Reynolds, that you should be able to add up how much all of your spending pledges have cost. But anyway, let's move on to the leaked Labour manifesto. So you want more people working from home. You want to scrap the Trade Union Act of 2016, which presumably means more strikes. You want to review fox hunting and talk about an Orgreave inquiry. Does Orgreave come up a lot on the doorstep?
Yes, those are all things. But first of all, let me say this is not the Labour manifesto. This is our process by which we get to the Labour manifesto. It's a process why people submit the bits of policy that they're interested in. There's a process, there are amendments, there's deliberation. So these are not statements of party policy. I think we do want to see the kind of employment laws that will protect family life, give people some time in order to do the other things that are important in life as well as work. I think that's been eroded very significantly in recent years. I think the labour market itself means that more people want flexibility in the workplace, but I'm absolutely confident in the aggregate platform we'll put forward is the one that will give people hope and optimism and turn this country round after 13 years of Conservative government.
So, Mr Reynolds, do you agree with your colleague Angela Rayner, then, that employees shouldn't receive calls or emails outside of working hours? In what way is that going to help the economy to grow if people can't be contacted after 5?
Well, this is a response we've seen in lots of countries to how technology has changed the way we work. I mean, France, Italy, Belgium, Spain have laws that are all in this area. As I say, this is not a definitive statement of party policy, but again, it's things that we are looking at that we will consider to make sure the balance is right. And I think everybody recognises that there has to be a balance between working life, family life, the other things that are important. The best employers already recognise that, and will look at the best approach to make sure that is the case. So it's an important area to consider. But this is not a statement of manifesto. This is a leak from the deliberations that we will have that will ultimately get to that manifesto where we'll decide the right way forward.
So the streets of Paris have been on fire and France has been plagued by protests for recent months. And the Labour Party thinks that France is a good model to follow.
No, we're not looking at... When people look at individual countries, whether it's Singapore or Germany or France, and say, we just take that policy position and political culture from that country and transport it here, that's not how politics works. But there are ideas from other countries. You should always be looking at what's working best. I mean, let's be frank, the UK is the worst performing major economy, so there will be ideas from other countries, other approaches. That is worth considering. But I think when it comes to fundamentally the need to do things differently to how they've been going for the last 13 years, that case is strongly evident, whether that's the kind of industrial policy I want to put forward or the kind of employment rights that will get that balance between family life and work right in the right place, making our trade agreement with the European Union work better. There's lots of areas we need to look at, and we'll look at the best practice and the best way to do that, and that's ultimately what the Labour manifesto will be.
So if you're happy with half of civil servants working from home and you want to advocate working from home, what are you going to do with all of the very expensive office space in central London that Gordon Brown moved the civil service into at great expense to the taxpayer?
Well, look, the people who try and posit this conversation post-pandemic as some sort of approach between everyone working from home and nobody working from home, I think just aren't aware of how the economy has developed. Now, for most workplaces, they need a commercial HQ. They will need a place, whether that's a civil service or a major corporate, where the workforce can come in. There's a part of any job which I think is learning from other colleagues, especially, I mean, I was a trainee solicitor. Much of that job was learning from your colleagues. But there's also a need with the more processing side of any role where you can have a bit of flexibility, where you can approach it in that way. So I don't think the long-term projections of the office, the tax base, the commercial property that we've got, whether that's for the civil service or for businesses, will decline significantly. But I do think the balance will change, because that's what many workers want, and that's what the labour market's actually delivering in many ways at the moment.
Is the civil service working well from home? Have you applied for a passport lately?
I, like most MPs, know that the best way to get a passport, the only way in many cases in the last few years, has been to actually contact your MP to do it. But I don't put the blame on civil servants for that. I put the blame on the government because there is no public service in this country that's working better after 13 years of Conservative government. And I think trying to blame the civil service, as the government tries to do, is weak and lacks accountability.
Sorry, if people are waiting too long for their passports, you're advocating that they contact their MP. Most people are waiting 8 to 10 weeks for a passport, myself included. We should be getting our MPs involved to fast-track passports. Why can't the Passport Office handle passport processing?
Many people need to contact their MPs when a public service isn't working well, and that is certainly my experience of the last few years. I've had to do quite a lot of passport cases when this has come up.
But this is the responsibility of the government.
Ministers are accountable. The way they try and blame civil servants, whether that's, well, frankly, in any area of public policy, they need to accept some responsibility. They've been in power for 13 years. This is the platform that they have promoted and delivered. And blaming other people, which seems to be a real feature of this government, I think lacks responsibility and accountability for the decisions they've made.
All right, I shall be making a call to my MP after this, try and get my passport. Thank you very much, Jonathan Reynolds. Now, I'm joined in the studio by former Australian High Commissioner to the UK and former Australian Attorney General George Brandis. Now, George, lovely to see you.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for coming in.
Pleasure.
I know you were heavily involved as Attorney General with the plan to stop the boats in Australia. Tell me how that worked and what the government needs to do to make their own policy work on this, George.
Well, a number of measures were put in place by the Australian government under the leadership of then Prime Minister Abbott, of which are offshore processing, which I know the United Kingdom is having a big debate about at the moment, was a key element of that suite of policies. But basically, Camilla, it also took a lot of political will. I in London in the last couple of weeks, I've followed this debate, and it is so reminiscent of the debate that we had in Australia in 2013 and 2014. But that debate dried up when the boats stopped.
Yes.
And the boats did stop.
But there was heavy opposition. I mean, I was going to ask you about what you made of the Archbishop of Canterbury talking about the Rwanda plan, saying that it's immoral. Presumably Australia also had opposition from churches, the left, everybody, but you went ahead with it nonetheless.
And the policy was so successful that the Labor Party, which was then the opposition, was shamed into doing a U-turn and adopting it so that it is now the bipartisan policy of Australian governments, both sides of Australian politics. Now, as to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is, of course, a good man, I do think it's wise that senior clergymen stay out of politics, frankly.
Yes. Now, looking at the policy itself as it is today, I mean, do you support the Rwanda policy in principle? Do you think it's a good idea?
Well, I don't have enough granular knowledge of it to say that without any hesitation, but what I do support, because it was successful in Australia, is the principle of offshore processing. Because when somebody comes to a country claiming to be a refugee, the obligation of that country, it's not to settle them. It's not to refool them to the place from which they claim they were fleeing persecution. And that obligation can be discharged either in the country to which they come, or in another country, in Australia, in Nauru, a nation in the South Pacific, in which we have entered into an offshore processing agreement.
But the idea is it's a deterrent, right?
Well, what you have to do, and let's call this for what it is. This is people smuggling.
Yeah.
And people smuggling is one of the most evil and insidious forms of international crime. And it really annoys me that people, including good people like the Archbishop of Canterbury, approach this as if it were something other than an attempt by the UK government to deal with this evil crime of people smuggling. The way you deal with people smuggling, the way that it worked in Australia, is to put the people smugglers out of business. And the way you put the people smugglers out of business is to ensure that they do not have a product to sell.
But then you have the criticism from the left, which will be, well, people don't have safe and legal routes, so they have to resort to these dangerous crossings across the channel in barely inflatable dinghies, and therefore the government isn't doing enough generally on the picture of migration. Having said that, I don't know if you've seen in the week, but the figure that is about to be announced in 2 weeks' time is that net migration is going to hit 1 million. What's your view from an Australian looking at the UK? Is that an acceptable number of migrants to be coming into this country, do you think?
I do not have a view as to what should be the right size of the UK population. And the Australian experience and the UK experience are quite different. Because in the United Kingdom, there is not a very big lobby, as far as I can see, that says that the population of Britain should be much bigger than it is. I mean, this is a relatively small country geographically, and it's quite crowded. In Australia, it is the opposite. We are a nation the size of the continental United States, but with a population of only 26 million people. So you don't get a debate in Australia about whether Australia is full. The debate is about how many more new migrants we should take in, rather than whether we should take in additional numbers at all. But the point here is about sovereignty. The Australian policy was called Operation Sovereign Borders. And that was a reflection of the fact that whatever is the optimal size of a nation's population, to the extent to which an important component of that population is migration intake, it is for that country to decide and police who's entitled to become a citizen.
Yes.
And the former Australian Prime Minister, John Howard, put it very well in a phrase that became almost iconic in Australia. He acknowledged Australia's humanitarian obligations, which, by the way, we fulfil more generously than most countries in the world. But then he went on to say, but we will decide who comes into this country and the circumstances in which they come. Now, that absolutely captured a public sentiment that I believe is as much in evidence in the United Kingdom as it was in Australia. People, I'm sure, good people of good faith, have no objection to providing help for genuine refugees, so long as the government controls the sovereignty of your borders.
Do you think that Rishi Sunak should therefore be a bit more Howard-esque in his language? I mean, is he being tough enough on this? What advice would you give him?
Well, look, it's not, Camilla, it's not for me to advise.
I know, but you're a very experienced politician, and therefore you'll be observing how he's handled it. And I'm wondering whether you think his handling is correct, because as you say, it was delicate for Abbott. You know, he had a huge amount of criticism.
Yeah, well, he did. But, I mean, one of the things about Tony Abbott is he is a political tough guy with tremendous willpower. Now, I've met Mr Sunak, but I don't claim to know him well. I think what matters more than the language is the firmness of purpose with which the policy is prosecuted. And on that score, it seems to me that Mr Sunak and his government are firm.
What else did you think about Mr Sunak when you met him, out of interest?
I think Mr Sunak's obviously a highly, highly competent individual. And the United Kingdom, you know, should be glad to have him, frankly, as your Prime Minister, because there are a lot of nations in the world which would love to have a Conservative Prime Minister as hugely competent and skillful as Rishi Sunak.
And hard-working, to be fair, to the Prime Minister. Let's talk about Australia and the Republic, the Republic campaign now. I thought it was interesting to see Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese quite happy and comfortable with the King at Buckingham Palace during the coronation celebrations. I think there was a bit of argy-bargy about, well, am I welcome in Australia? You haven't extended an invitation yet. Obviously, Albanese is a Republican. He's appointed this Minister for the Republic. How likely is it that Australia holds another referendum on this issue, do you think?
The policy of the Labor government in Australia, led, as you say, by Anthony Albanese, is to progress the issue of the Republic, but not in its first term. It's not an issue that Anthony Albanese has particularly pressed. I mean, you say there's a Minister for the Republic. Look, you know, I know the guy. He's a junior minister. He doesn't sit in cabinet, and the Republic is sort of a miscellany of different portfolio issues that he's dealing with. So I wouldn't overinterpret that. That said, though, almost exclusively in Australia, the Labor Party and the left are in favour of a republic. Most Conservatives are not. Last time this was put to the test in Australia was in 1999. It was defeated by referendum in every state. Remember, we have a written constitution in Australia. You couldn't do this without amending the constitution. To amend the constitution requires a special majority. And what happened in 1999, I think, would always happen whenever there is a referendum on this. It would become a proxy question for what's wrong with our current constitution.
Yes.
And so the
sorry, I was going to say, is it a concern to the Australian people? I mean, is it atop of the agenda for Australian people, not least with the cost of living crisis and inflation affecting you as much as us? I say that because over here, some of the polling is suggesting that the monarchy is becoming less popular with the under 30s. And I suppose if you looked at Australians who are young, you might think that they might think, well, what's the point of having the king as head of state? The other problem, of course, being that he's not as popular as his late mother.
Yeah, but these things fluctuate. I mean, I'm old enough to remember even a time when the late Queen was not as popular. You know, she was always popular, of course, but you know, her popularity went up and down at a fairly high range in the band. And I think King Charles, who I had quite a bit to do with when I was the High Commissioner in his then capacity as Prince of Wales, and who I should say is a great lover of Australia and went to secondary school for a while in Australia. I think he is a good man, and his goodness will be so evident to the Australian people. He is a man, in my view, who has chosen to take advantage of the accident of nature that saw him born to be king to do good in the world.
Final question. Should he visit Australia first, or should it be left to the Prince and Princess of Wales, who, one could argue, might be a little more of celebrities and the kind of people that the Australians would rather see than perhaps the King and Queen? Or is that unfair?
Camilla, I'm going to avoid your question. Both would be very welcome, but I would point out that King Charles does have these long historical links with Australia. He's visited Australia, I think, 17 times since he went to school.
No, but I remember being on that trip where Prince George was taken and he proved to be the kind of Republican dragon slayer. So the children are quite effective in Australia.
Absolutely. I think that in each generation, the royal family generates new stars. And the popularity, the enduring popularity over centuries, since the advent of parliamentary democracy of the royal family, reflects that fact.
George Brandis, thank you very much for joining me in the studio this morning. Lovely to see you.
Pleasure, Camilla.
Thank you. Now, let's get back to Hemel Hempstead and the People's Panel. Tom Harwood is there. Tom, let us know, what have they made of the interviews we've had this morning?
Yes, Camilla, so much to digest there on those three wide-ranging interviews. We're here with John, Maud and Richard still. And Maud, when we were listening to what Grant Shapps had to say about the EU law U-turn, you seem to get a bit exercised, particularly about how Kemi Badenoch has behaved this week.
It was really disappointing. Really disappointing. It's like they've thrown Brexit off the back of the boat, haven't they? Kemi Badenoch was such a promising, young, vibrant, forthright woman. And certainly in the leadership contest, there was so much support for her and so much hope. And this week's performance really... it was that hint of arrogance that we were discussing that I think has let a lot of people down. But hopefully, as we've said, that she will learn from that and pick herself back up and move forward. But yes, that this week, as far as Brexit's concerned, has been utterly devastating.
And Richard, as an electric car driver, the ULEZ discussion that we saw with Jonathan Reynolds, how did that affect you?
Well, cars are cleaner than they've ever been. There isn't a car out there that isn't fitted with either a catalyser or a catalytic converter. Is far more efficient than cars of years ago. So hearing Reynolds trying to defend the ULEZ, Khan's policy is frankly ridiculous, and I think it's probably best summed up by Mr. Lammy, who said that if you're a plumber, you should be using public transport to go and do your various jobs, which sounds great, doesn't it? Carrying around a gas boiler and 3-metre lengths of copper pipe, you know. We need these people to do the jobs that we need them to do in London. And if they can't do it, what will people do for routine maintenance, for boiler servicing, etc., etc.? It's just a ridiculous policy which needs to be stamped on. But Labour, just busy defending it.
Well, it was really interesting to see how Jonathan Reynolds said this is to do with the mayor rather than the Labour Party, as if they're entirely separate.
Yes, it does smack a little bit of they're trying to take a back step and disassociate themselves with Mayor Khan.
Well, let's turn to this question of energy infrastructure, because it to me, I don't know, do you think that Grant Shapps answered your question, John?
Frankly, not in the least. I don't think that the non-technical politicians, which is the vast majority of them, have actually been able to understand the consequences of a wholesale switch in energy consumption. The energy density of gas in pipes is very high. Electricity requires cables of varying sizes, substations, transformers. The infrastructure is in many ways far more complicated than gas. And simply to push hundreds of amps into each domestic dwelling to run the heating, charge the cars plural probably in many homes, do the cooking and everything else. We just need a wholesale upgrade of infrastructure. Now, I know that there are cables in the ground that were buried in the 1890s. They are done by Victorian electrical engineers, and they were of exceedingly high quality, and they've lasted over 100 years. But their size is the issue. It's not the quality of the stuff in the ground. You wouldn't replace it except that you need more capacity.
No, it's a huge, huge task that perhaps we haven't really fully woken up to. I do want to mention the George Brandis interview there. Australia's experience with stopping small boats coming to that country. I'm going to throw this one open to the panel. Does anyone have anything to say about what the UK perhaps could learn from Australia?
Well, if you don't mind me saying, following the policy that they've done there, it seems that we're probably about 2 or 3 years behind in the process. And listening to Mr. Welby talk about it, my first thought was, well, who voted for you, Mr. Welby? This should be down to our elected politicians. And hearing various people like Mr. Welby speak about it, I just think, yeah, fine, you're entitled to an opinion, Mr. Welby, but I want our elected politicians to deal with this, and I want it dealt with in a humane, just fashion. I want refugees to be able to come here. We've welcomed over 500,000 since 2014 or 2015, I think it is. But frankly, the boat situation can be summed up. I don't know if you remember a few years ago in Greece, there was an issue with a boat, and there was a horrible photograph of a police officer carrying a dead child. And that's just unacceptable.
Maud, do you have any views on the Archbishop getting involved in policy in such an unusual way this week?
I do actually, Tom. No, Justin. Stick to the pulpit.
And John, on this question, I suppose it opens up bigger questions about the role of the House of Lords and bishops in general.
Yeah, it certainly does. I think Welby needs to, as a Christian minister, to stick to biblical principles of morality, which he clearly doesn't in a vast number of areas. And the question of refugees and giving succour to those who are in trouble is definitely a Christian moral value. But we're not talking about refugees. People are not fleeing France because it is an oppressive regime. They're leaving France because they would prefer to be in the UK. They cannot be refugees by definition. Now, I know refugees from Iran persecuted for religious belief. I know refugees from Ukraine. We look after refugees, but economic migrants and people trafficking, that's a very different thing.
It's that distinction that needs to be made clear. Well, Camilla, those are the views of the panel here in Hemel Hempstead. I'll hand back to you.
I'm loving the People's Panel from Hemel Hempstead. Thank you very much, Tom. Great job. Don't forget, if you want to apply to next week's panel, go to gbnews.uk/panel. Now, coming up, are the Lib Dems preparing to go into coalition with Labour? It's a question that their leader, Sir Ed Davey, has repeatedly refused to answer, and something I'll be asking Lib Dem MP Christine Jardine in just a moment. Back in a jiffy, don't go anywhere.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m.
What's the scoop?
I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians.
That's right.
As we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight.
We're going to get into trouble.
If it's a big story, we'll be covering it.
Spill some tea on him.
There we go.
But we'll also have some fun.
I wouldn't stick up a bank.
My father didn't love me. So anyway.
Headliners every night from 11 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prison?
I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed. So I guess they've always been quite woke. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Lovely to have your company this morning. Now, we've succeeded in getting a serving Liberal Democrat MP to appear on GB News. Christine Jardine joins me now. She's the MP for Edinburgh West. Christine, I hope you can hear me. Now, there's been lots of talk about coalition. We had the local election results. Labour needed a 10% swing. They only got a 5% swing. We're heading for a hung parliament. The Lib Dems might need to prop up a minority Labour government. Would you do that, Christine?
What we are doing is making sure that we win as many seats from every party as we possibly can. We are not talking about coalitions. We are out there working hard. We are not taking voters for granted in the way the Conservative Party do. We are out there. We are working for every vote in the general election, whenever it might come. But remember, we don't know when it's got to be. And until then, instead of focusing on process, which the Conservatives seem to love at the moment because it distracts from what a mess they're making of the economy, the NHS, sewage on our beaches, instead of doing that, we should be working to clear these problems up instead of distracting from them by talking about the general election when we don't know when it's going to be.
I know you're a really straight-talking woman. I'm a straight-talking woman. Let's just get down to the brass tacks here. The Lib Dems aren't going to win the next election. That looks highly, highly unlikely. What looks likely is a hung parliament situation. Can we just discuss whether this is something you will consider? You know what our viewers and listeners are like. They just want a straight answer to their straight question. I'm sure the Lib Dems can do it. Will Sir Ed Davey consider propping up a Keir Starmer government? Can we talk in those terms?
Yeah, we can talk about it when the general election comes. We will be talking about the general election, but what we will not be talking about is a coalition. We have no plans at the moment to enter a coalition.
So you're
with
ruling
anyone.
out a coalition?
We want to win as many seats. We want to win as many seats as we possibly can at the next election.
Okay.
That's where our focus is.
All right, I know
That's
you
what
do.
we're thinking about.
I know.
And that is a straight answer for people who want to know what we are doing. We are focusing on winning as many seats as we possibly can, so people get better representation than they have had during this Conservative government.
I'm going to make this really simple, okay? Coalition with Labour, there are 3 potential answers. Yes, no, maybe. Christine.
Oh, sorry, coalition with Labour is not something we are talking about. I don't know how often I have to say this before you get it. We are only focusing on what we do. What Labour do is entirely up to the voters.
Okay.
They will vote for Labour in the seats where Labour can win, and they will vote for us in the seats where we can win, because the priority, as we have seen from the Conservatives' last debacle at the local council elections this month, is that people are sick and tired of the way they are running the country, and they want to change the government.
Or maybe?
And to do that, they will vote for us, or they will vote for Labour, so that the Conservatives do not have the biggest number of seats in the next Parliament.
Is that a no or maybe?
No, what I'm telling you is what we are thinking. And what we are thinking is that we will be contesting every single seat in this country against every single party. And we will be doing everything we can to increase the number of Liberal Democrat seats. And we're in second place in 80 to 90 seats across the country, to all parties. And we will be doing everything we can to win in seats like Sheffield Hallam, which we want to take from Labour. We just recently took Hull Council seats there back from Labour. So this story about us and Labour is being, I think, frankly, is coming from the Conservatives, who want to distract from the mess they have made of the country, and the fact that at the moment they're torn apart by this internal division about what they should be doing, and where is Boris Johnson, and having separate conferences. Now, that's bad for the country, and that has to stop.
Christine Jardine, thank you very much indeed for joining me this morning. I'm still
You're very welcome.
Still not clear on whether there is going to be a coalition with Labour, but there we have it. Now, coming up, what is it like to be living with OCD, but also living with it in Parliament? That's something a senior Tory MP, Sir Charles Walker, has been telling me about. You'll be able to hear my interview with him in just a moment. Don't go anywhere.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Deebs & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
GB News has its own late-night paper preview show, Headliners, where comedians take you through the next day's top news stories. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper, we've got it covered for you. Headliners, every night at 11 p.m, and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Start the day with GB News.
We catch up on all the big stories you didn't hear the night before.
And take a look at what the world's talking about this morning. That's right, Monday to Thursdays from 6 o'clock. It's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Straight after breakfast, join us, Bev Turner and Andrew Pearce. We're going to take you through till noon.
We'll be tackling the big topics of the day, including the things that the other channels just won't talk about. If it's happening here. Wake up to mornings on GB News, the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Member of Parliament for North East Somerset and a former government minister. For years, I've walked the corridors of power in both Westminster and the City of London. We need to have the arguments, the discussions on how we make it better.
Crop failures, famine, war, suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
We are putting the cart before the horse. As Charles I said at the scaffold, he was the true defender of liberty.
Yeah, I've completely derailed the conversation.
Join me Monday to Thursday at 8 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Lovely to see you this morning. Now, Mental Health Awareness Week starts tomorrow. Earlier in the week, I spoke to Sir Charles Walker, Tory grandee and MP for Broxbourne. He has obsessive-compulsive disorder and started off by telling me what it's like to live with the condition.
So I obsess over things. So when it's particularly active, I do a lot of counting, a lot of hand washing, a lot of bargaining. You make pacts with yourself. So if you have to do X, Y, and Z, because if you don't, something awful will happen. So I mentioned it in the chamber. I personally regard it as a gift. I know for many it is a terrible demon that creates huge upset and pain. But I've always said it's made me more empathetic and understanding, having to sort of wrestle with it.
When did
myself.
you first notice that you had it?
When I was 13, and I had no idea what it was. And really, I don't think I properly worked out what it was until I became a Member of Parliament.
And why? Because you were more grown up and you could...
Because somebody sent me a book on OCD, and I think I recall, I thought, oh my God, I've been found out. You know, they've spotted me on the benches with a tick or something. You get these nervous ticks. That's sort of when I realised what it was. I mean, my family have known I've had it for years, going in and out of rooms 20 times, turning off light switches, washing hands, so on and so forth. But as I say, there are times when it's particularly active and times when it's not. So times when you change, when there's big change in your life, it becomes very active. So, for example, when I became a Member of Parliament, it sort of went into sort of uber overdrive, and now it's in a calmer phase.
And it's kind of been misunderstood over the years. You know, people use the term OCD quite casually to suggest it refers to people who are obsessive about tidying. That's not what we're talking about here, is it? Just explain how it actually works in your own brain, which...
So, look, I have a mild form of OCD, but there are some people where it is absolutely life-changing. So they might have to blink 1,000 times and they lose count at 998 or something and have to start again. And I mean, there are people with OCD who end up in mental health wards because they require significant interventions. And I have enormous sympathy for them. Luckily, there are treatments that one can undertake that can ease people's symptoms, how it manifests itself. But for people at the extreme end, it is absolutely life-changing. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but likewise, I've learned to live with it. It gives me a degree of insight, I think, to myself and others that I wouldn't have. And I can talk to people with OCD and be empathetic and sympathetic.
And what's the significance of doing things in eights?
It's finding balance. I've always said it's about finding balance. So that's where I'm in equilibrium, if you do something that you find balance.
How was it received when you made the speech in 2012? Because actually, when it comes to acceptance of mental health, a lot's happened in the last decade.
I think it's been extraordinary. What I did was tiny. My colleague Kevan Jones on the Labour benches talked about living with depression, and he is an amazing man. This is something that afflicts lots of people. I'm not at the extreme end. We have to understand that there's a spectrum of mental health illness, and Some people suffer with life-changing illnesses. It's like we mustn't say that having a cold as a physical illness is the same as having cancer or heart disease. There is a spectrum. Sure. I remain concerned that if you have a diagnosis of psychosis schizophrenia, it is still the case that your life is shortened on average by 15 to 20 years. So when people say, have we made progress? We will have made progress where that diagnosis does not significantly shorten your life, and we're a long way off from reaching that stage.
Are you concerned about the availability of treatment? Have you sought treatment yourself?
I haven't sought treatment myself. I think undoubtedly mental health services are overstretched. There's a very high demand for them. That demand was accelerated by COVID. And the lockdowns. There's lots of people who are managing a condition, had it under control, be it an eating disorder, be it an anxiety disorder, be it depression, who have coping structures around them. So I have an enormously supportive family and friends. But if you strip away that coping structure, if you remove people from seeing their family, you remove people from seeing their friends, it was the case that for some, the world crowded in on them again. And an illness they had under control suddenly surged back into their lives. And that undoubtedly is placing a pressure on already stretched mental health services.
Was it a sign of the times that perhaps the government did undercook the mental impact of the pandemic? Obviously, lots was made about protecting people and saving the NHS, but it's left a legacy, particularly among younger people, of huge amounts of anxiety, of depression.
They talk about, isn't it, I think it's sort of parity, equality between physical and mental health. I don't think mental health got a look in during the pandemic response. I think some of the stuff around targeted at children, if you go and see your granny, you'll kill her, was simply appalling. I mean, it was absolutely appalling. And people need to be held to account for that, in my view. Look, my views on lockdown are not a secret. I spoke against lockdown repeatedly. I warned against its implications. I warned how it would impact people with mental health conditions. I warned how it would change our approach, for example, to civil liberties and protest. And I think in the main, my warnings have been borne out. Obviously, I failed to change the weather while the lockdowns were going on. I entirely agree. The first lockdown of 6 to 7 weeks was necessary. None of us knew what we were facing. But once the information became available that this disease largely targeted the elderly and those with underlying health conditions, we could have done things far more humanely.
Obviously, you've done very well, actually, in your area of Hertfordshire. How bad do you think they were for the Conservatives?
So I'm in South Hertfordshire. I border London, and the M25 is our border. I think the Conservatives could have done worse, and Labour could have done better. It wasn't a great night for the Conservatives by any stretch of the imagination.
But you think they could have done worse?
We could have done worse. We could, and perhaps after the ructions of last October with 3 prime ministers in the space of 50 days, we deserved to do worse. And I think Labour could have done better. Of course, Labour had many successes over the night, and we had many upsets and failures. But I don't think the Conservatives are out of the running come the next general election, which I suspect will be in the autumn of next year. And I'm not standing in that general election.
Yeah, but you're not standing. And tell us why, because that's not exactly a ringing endorsement of the future of Rishi Sunak's government.
That's absolutely not the case, because I announced I was leaving Parliament in February of last year, so February 2022. I felt that I'd done it for 18 years then. No, 17 years then. It looks like I'm going to do it for 19 and a half years. And I've always been clear, you've got to want to be a Member of Parliament 100%, 110%. Now, I love being in Parliament and legislating in Parliament, but I'm struggling to bring that same level of energy to my constituency duties. And being a Member of Parliament isn't about me, it's about my constituents, and they deserve a shiny new Member of Parliament who will be 110% enthusiastic on their behalf. And I think that's really important. We all have a last day in Parliament, well, almost all of us, unless you die in service, but we all have a last day in Parliament. And I don't want to outstay my welcome as far as my constituents are concerned.
But are you also worried about the direction politics is going in?
Members of Parliament try really hard to do the right thing. I think it is often difficult to do the right thing. We have a very demanding audience and we have very demanding constituents. And I just think it's a difficult place. I would find it really difficult now to recommend somebody come here who is succeeding in their 30s and 40s. Say you're a fantastically successful lawyer or accountant. I would say to them, you're going to leave your successful practice to enter the uncertain world of politics. And when you leave politics, it will be very difficult to pick up your career where you left. I think we've professionalised politics, and I think that's a mistake. I think a lot of my colleagues are subjected to unbearable and indefensible levels of abuse by people. Now, most of our constituents are lovely, warm people, whatever their politics, but there is a nasty underbelly in most constituencies of quite thuggish, aggressive people who feel that they can get away with saying what they like and threatening what they like. And actually, that is going to deter further good people from entering politics.
But some of those people presumably are Labour activists.
I think some of them might be. I don't know who they are. I don't look too closely.
I'm thinking about criticisms of Tories has come from the Deputy Labour leader herself. You know, Angela Rayner describing Tories as scum. That can't help the political environment.
It can't. We can all make mistakes, though. What I don't want to do is pile in on Angela or anybody. We can all make mistakes. God knows I've made loads of mistakes in my parliamentary career.
Final question on housing, because I know you've written for Conservative Home. Do you think the Conservatives have built enough housing? I
want to see housing built 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days of the year.
Does that mean you want to concrete over the countryside?
It is a noble... All houses are built on what was once countryside. I mean, there's nonsense that people think that their house wasn't built on what was once a green field, a forest, a meadow. All of our houses are built on countryside. When you move into a community, that does not buy you the right to stop other people moving into that community at a later date. We have to build homes. It's an inescapable fact. And I just get incredibly frustrated by people who've got so much, and they tend to be older people like me, being so ungenerous to the next generation.
But then you're talking about your own NIMBY Tory voters.
Well, in Broxbourne, we didn't seem to suffer from NIMBYism. We returned all our 9 council seats we were defending. We've built houses, we've built flats. We promote the interests of young people in Broxbourne. Look, the young people looking to get on the housing ladder gave up the most during the COVID lockdowns. They were the ones who weren't allowed to go into work. They were the ones who had to stay at home, often working in cramped, rented flats to keep the elderly safe. And just, you're not necessarily rich because you're old, but it is a fact that the older you get, the more likely you are to become a homeowner. And I just think, given the sacrifices our youngsters made during the COVID lockdowns, actually a national drive to give them the homes that they deserve. Yes, we can have people living in social housing, housing association houses. That's fantastic. Those are homes as well. But giving people the opportunity to buy a home, get on the housing ladder, that is fundamentally a Conservative thing to do. And we should be doing it.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
That was Sir Charles Walker. I'll be back next week at 9:30. Up next, here's Michael Portillo.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.